Have you ever felt like your prayers were met with silence, like you've been waiting endlessly for an answer, for a breakthrough, for a sign? Maybe you've whispered in the quiet of your heart, "God, why is it taking so long?" If you've ever found yourself in that space between asking and receiving, between hope and doubt, then this message is for you. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most profound truths of our faith. God's timing is perfect. It's a truth that's easy to believe when life flows smoothly, but it's in the seasons of waiting, when doors remain closed, when answers seem delayed, when the silence feels deafening, that our trust is truly tested. But what if I told you that those seasons of waiting are not wasted? That God is not ignoring you, but orchestrating something far greater than you can imagine? In this video, we'll explore the beauty and the power of trusting God's perfect timing. Through scripture, personal reflection, and timeless wisdom, we'll uncover how waiting on God isn't about passively sitting still, but about actively growing in faith, patience, and surrender. We'll see how God's plans often exceed our timelines and why His delays are not His denials. But before we dive in, let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized, in hindsight, that God's timing was absolutely perfect? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of divine timing, type, "I trust God's perfect timing," as a declaration of your faith. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. By doing this, you're not just supporting this channel, you're becoming part of a mission to spread God's word and inspire faith across the world. So, take a deep breath, open your heart, and let's journey together into the incredible truth that God's timing is always perfect. Stay with us until the end, because this might just be the message you've been waiting for. Let's begin. Number 1, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. Have you ever paused to consider how perfectly orchestrated the natural world is? The sun rises and sets with unwavering precision. The tides flow in and out, guided by unseen forces. Seasons change. Spring melts into summer, summer fades into fall, and winter prepares the world to begin again. Everything has its appointed time. And yet, when it comes to our own lives, we often resist this natural order. We want answers now. We want progress immediately. We want breakthroughs on our timeline, not God's. But Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 reminds us of a profound truth. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And it's not just poetic language, it's a divine blueprint for how we are meant to understand time and trust God's sovereignty over it. Every joy, every struggle, every waiting period serves a purpose in God's grand design. Think about it. If a farmer plants seeds in winter, no amount of effort or pleading will force them to grow before spring. The ground must first thaw, the soil must soften, and the sun must return to its place in the sky. In the same way, our lives have seasons, and each season carries lessons, blessings, and opportunities uniquely crafted by God. Yet waiting is hard, isn't it? Especially in a world that thrives on instant gratification. We live in an age where patience feels almost obsolete. A message isn't answered in 5 minutes, and we're already questioning the other person's priorities. A dream doesn't materialize in a year, and we start doubting if it was ever meant to be. But God doesn't operate on our rushed timelines. He's not driven by our impatience. He works with precision, intention, and love. Consider the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Joseph's life seemed to spiral further away from the dreams God had given him. But through each hardship, God was positioning Joseph exactly where he needed to be. Years later, Joseph rose to power in Egypt, saving entire nations from famine, including the very brothers who had betrayed him. Imagine if Joseph had given up during the waiting. Imagine if he had doubted God's timing. Joseph's story is a mirror for our own seasons of waiting. Sometimes God's delays are not his denials, they're his preparations. He's aligning circumstances, shaping our character, and preparing blessings that far exceed our understanding. So if you find yourself in a season of waiting today, know this: God is not late. He is never late. But how do we live in this tension between the promise and the fulfillment, between the seed and the harvest? The answer lies in surrender. Trusting God's timing doesn't mean we stop dreaming, stop praying, or stop hoping. It means we do all those things while letting go of our need for control. We plant the seeds, water them with faith, and leave the growth to God. Maybe you've been praying for healing, for a job, for a restored relationship, or for clarity about your purpose. And maybe the silence feels heavy. But remember, silence is not absence. God hears every prayer, sees every tear, and knows every longing of your heart. Let me share a brief story with you. A woman once prayed fervently for a new job after losing her previous one. Weeks turned into months, and no opportunities arose. She began to doubt, asking God why he wasn't answering her prayer. Then almost a year later, she was offered a position in a company that aligned perfectly with her skills and passion. The delay had been necessary, not because God was ignoring her, but because he was preparing her for something better. Perhaps today, God is preparing you. Perhaps he's aligning opportunities, refining your character, or creating connections behind the scenes that you can't yet see. The waiting isn't wasted. It's sacred ground where God does some of his most transformative work. So let me ask you, are you willing to trust him in the waiting? Are you willing to believe that his timing is not just good, but perfect? If you are, I invite you to declare it in the comments below. Write, "I trust God's perfect timing." Not just as a statement, but as a declaration of faith, a reminder to yourself and to others who might be struggling with their own waiting seasons. As we move forward, we'll dive even deeper into how we can recognize God's timing in our lives and how to find peace in the process. Stay with us, because the journey is just beginning and the best is yet to come. Number 2, Psalm chapter 27, verse 14. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. Waiting, it's one of the hardest things we're called to do as believers. In a world where everything is at our fingertips, where answers are just a click away, and where impatience feels almost natural, waiting feels foreign, uncomfortable, and sometimes even unfair. Yet in Psalm chapter 27, verse 14, we are given a clear instruction. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. These words aren't merely a suggestion, they're a lifeline for every season of uncertainty. But what does it truly mean to wait on the Lord? Does it mean sitting passively, doing nothing, and hoping something magical happens? Absolutely not. Waiting on God is an active process. It's leaning into his promises, anchoring ourselves in his word, and choosing trust over doubt every single day. It's not about doing nothing, it's about doing the right things while we wait. Imagine an artist painting a masterpiece. Each brushstroke is intentional, every color carefully chosen. But if you were to walk into the studio midway through the process, you might see something incomplete, messy, and chaotic. You might even question if the artist knows what they're doing. But the artist has a vision, a plan that you cannot yet see. In the same way, God is the master artist of our lives. We might only see the mess, the unfinished strokes, and the confusing colors, but he sees the full picture. And every stroke of his brush is painted with love, purpose, and perfect timing. King David, who wrote this psalm, knew all too well the weight of waiting. Anointed as king at a young age, David didn't immediately ascend to the throne. Instead, he spent years running for his life, hiding in caves and facing betrayal from those he trusted. But through it all, David didn't lose hope. He anchored himself in God's promises and chose to wait with faith, even when the circumstances around him screamed otherwise. Can you imagine the strength it takes to wait while everything in you wants to move forward? To wait when fear whispers that God might have forgotten you? This kind of waiting isn't weak. It's courageous. It's the kind of strength that doesn't come from ourselves, but is drawn directly from God. Now let's make it personal. Think about a time in your life when you had no choice but to wait, maybe for an answer, a breakthrough, or a resolution to a painful situation. How did you handle that season? Did you lean into God, or did frustration and doubt take over? A woman once shared her testimony about waiting on God. She had been praying for years for her husband to come to faith. Year after year, prayer after prayer, she saw no change. At times she felt like giving up, convinced her prayers were in vain. But one day, after more than a decade of praying, her husband walked into church, gave his life to Christ, and became a testimony to God's faithfulness. She realized that every prayer, every tear, and every moment of waiting had been worth it. What would have happened if she had stopped praying? What if she had stopped believing? Sometimes God's delays are not denials, they are divine setups for something far greater than we could have asked for or imagined. But here's the key. While we wait, we must guard our hearts against bitterness, doubt, and fear. It's easy to let those feelings creep in and poison our faith. But instead of focusing on what we don't see, we must focus on what we know. And what do we know? That God is good, that His promises are true, that His love is unwavering. So, how do we wait well? We wait with expectancy, not passivity. We continue to worship, to pray, to serve, and to grow. We lean into God's presence, allowing His peace to sustain us in the moments when impatience starts to rise. Let me ask you, are you waiting on God for something today? A breakthrough, a miracle, a restored relationship, or a long-awaited promise? If so, I encourage you to write in the comments below, "I will wait on the Lord with faith." Let that be your declaration today, a reminder to yourself and an encouragement to others who are walking through similar seasons. In the next section, we'll explore how trust and surrender are deeply connected to God's timing. Because waiting isn't just about patience, it's about trust. And when we trust in God's perfect timing, we open our hearts to experience His power in ways we never thought possible. Stay with us, because the journey is just beginning. Number 3, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. There's a profound promise tucked within Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. It doesn't just tell us to wait, it tells us what happens when we wait. It promises renewal, strength, and endurance. But notice something important. This verse doesn't say, those who rush ahead will find strength, or those who figure everything out on their own will rise up. No, it specifically says, those who wait on the Lord. Waiting isn't just a passive activity. It's an active reliance on God. It's a choice to lean into His strength rather than our own. It's a declaration that we trust His plan, even when we can't see the full picture. But let's be honest, waiting feels draining. It feels like an empty space where nothing happens. So how can the Bible promise renewed strength in the very season that feels most exhausting? The answer lies in the object of our waiting. When we wait on God, we're not waiting on a vague hope or an uncertain outcome. We're waiting on the Creator of the universe, the one who spoke stars into existence, the one who knows every detail of our lives. That kind of waiting isn't weakness. It's the most powerful thing we can do. Think about the imagery in this verse. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. Why an eagle? Because eagles don't waste energy flapping their wings endlessly to stay airborne. They spread their wings wide and allow the wind to carry them higher. In the same way, when we wait on God, we stop relying on our own limited strength and instead allow His power to lift us above our struggles, our doubts, and our exhaustion. There's a story about a man who was training for a marathon. Every morning, he would wake up early, lace up his shoes, and start running. At first, the miles felt impossible. His legs ached, his chest burned, and the finish line felt so far away. But over time, something amazing happened. His body adapted, his stamina increased, and what once felt impossible became natural. He learned an important lesson. Endurance isn't built in a single moment. It's built through consistent, patient effort. The same is true for our spiritual endurance. Seasons of waiting are not wasted time. They're training grounds. They're where we learn to rely on God, where we build spiritual stamina, and where we discover that His strength is made perfect in our weakness. But here's the key. Waiting isn't about doing nothing. It's about doing the right things. It's about staying connected to God through prayer, immersing ourselves in His Word, and surrounding ourselves with people who remind us of His promises. Waiting on God doesn't mean we stop living. It means we live expectantly. Think of a farmer again. After planting seeds, he doesn't sit back and hope for the best. He waters, he weeds, he tends to his crops with care. In the same way, waiting on God involves action. It involves preparing our hearts, tending to our faith, and staying expectant for the harvest God has promised. Maybe you're in a season right now where you feel like you're running out of strength. Maybe your prayers feel unanswered, your dreams feel distant, or your heart feels heavy with uncertainty. But let me remind you of this truth. God has not forgotten you. He sees you, He knows you, and He promises to renew your strength if you will wait on Him. Take a moment and let these words settle in your heart. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. That's not just a poetic promise. It's a reality available to every believer who chooses to trust God's timing. And here's something to reflect on. Are you flapping your wings in exhaustion, trying to do everything in your own strength? Or are you spreading your wings and letting God's power lift you? If this message speaks to you, let it be a declaration in your heart. I will wait on the Lord, and He will renew my strength. In the next section, we'll explore how God often uses seasons of waiting to prepare us for the blessings He's about to pour into our lives. Because waiting isn't just about what we're hoping for, it's about who we're becoming in the process. Number 4. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 3. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. There's a special kind of wait that comes with waiting for something you know God has promised you. You've prayed about it, you've received confirmation in your spirit, and yet, silence. Time stretches on, and the vision God gave you begins to feel more like a distant dream than a coming reality. But Habakkuk reminds us of something powerful. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. An appointed time. That phrase changes everything. It means God isn't running late. It means He's not adjusting His plans based on circumstances. It means there's a set time marked on God's divine calendar for the vision to come to pass. And when it does, it will speak. It will become so clear, so undeniable, that all the waiting, all the wondering will make sense. But what do we do in the meantime? How do we handle the tension between the promise and its fulfillment? Imagine this. You're at an airport, waiting for a flight. The ticket in your hand tells you the plane is coming. The schedule confirms it. But as you sit there, time seems to slow down. You glance at the clock, you glance at the gate, and doubt starts to creep in. What if something went wrong? What if the flight never arrives? But the reality is, the plane is still on schedule. Your anxiety doesn't change the timetable, it only affects how you experience the wait. That's how it is with God's promises. The vision hasn't been cancelled, it's just waiting for its appointed time. And during that waiting period, we have a choice. We can allow doubt, fear, and impatience to rob us of our peace, or we can anchor ourselves in the promise and trust that God's timing is always perfect. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to wait for their appointed time. Think of Abraham. God promised him descendants as numerous as the stars, yet he waited decades for Isaac to be born. Think of Noah, who built an ark on dry land while people mocked him. Year after year, hammer after hammer, Noah remained faithful to the vision God had given him. Waiting isn't passive, it's an active display of trust. It's a declaration that you believe God is who He says He is and that He will do what He said He will do. But let's be honest, it's not easy. It requires faith, endurance, and a willingness to surrender our timeline to God's perfect schedule. There's a story of a young man who had a dream of starting his own ministry. He felt the calling deeply, and he was ready to step into it immediately. But doors kept closing, opportunities seemed scarce, and every attempt to move forward felt like hitting a wall. Frustrated and confused, he brought his concerns before God. Over time, he realized that God wasn't saying no, He was saying not yet. During that season of waiting, the young man grew in wisdom, developed skills, and built relationships that would later become vital to his ministry. When the appointed time finally arrived, he stepped into his calling with confidence, fully prepared for what God had planned. Looking back, he realized that if he had rushed ahead on his own timeline, he wouldn't have been ready for the responsibility God had entrusted to him. Sometimes God delays a promise because He's preparing us for it. Other times, He's preparing the circumstances around us. Either way, the delay is intentional, not accidental. So here's something to consider. Are you holding on to the vision God gave you, or have you let discouragement and doubt convince you to let it go? Remember, though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. That's not just encouragement, it's a promise. God doesn't lie. If He's given you a vision, a dream, or a promise, it's coming. Maybe not on your timeline, but in His perfect time. Let this truth sink in. God is never late, and His promises are never empty. If you're in a season of waiting, hold on to this verse, write it down, speak it over your situation, and remember that the vision God gave you has an appointed time. As we move into the next section, we'll explore how God often uses seasons of waiting not just to prepare the promise, but to prepare you. Because the wait isn't just about what you're hoping for, it's about who you're becoming in the process. Number 5, Romans chapter 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Have you ever faced a moment in life where everything seemed to fall apart? A season where nothing made sense, where prayers felt unanswered, and the road ahead looked completely uncertain. In those moments, it's easy to question God's plan. It's easy to wonder, how could any good possibly come from this? But in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, we're given a promise that shines like a beacon of hope. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This verse doesn't say that everything we experience will feel good. It doesn't promise that every chapter of our story will be comfortable, easy, or free from pain. Instead, it promises that God is working through everything, even the struggles, even the setbacks, even the moments of deepest disappointment. Think about a master artist working on a mosaic. Up close, all you see are scattered pieces, shards of glass, fragments of broken tiles. It looks messy, chaotic, and unfinished. But when you step back, the artist's vision becomes clear. Each piece, no matter how sharp or misplaced it might have seemed, has a purpose. In the same way, God is weaving every moment of our lives, both the joyful ones and the painful ones, into a masterpiece that reflects His glory and goodness. But here's the hard truth. Sometimes we won't see the full picture while we're still in the middle of the process. Sometimes we'll have to trust that God is working even when we can't see how. There's a story about a young woman who lost her dream job unexpectedly. She had prayed for this job, worked hard for it, and believed it was exactly where God wanted her to be. When it was taken away, she was devastated. But in the months that followed, she discovered a passion for serving others through volunteer work, something she never would have pursued if she had stayed in her job. That volunteer experience eventually led to an opportunity she couldn't have imagined, leading a non-profit organization that impacted thousands of lives. In the moment of her loss, it didn't feel good. It felt like the end of a dream, but God was working behind the scenes, using what seemed like a setback as a setup for something far greater. Maybe you're in a season right now where you can't see how your current struggle could possibly work out for good. Maybe your heart feels heavy and your spirit feels weary. But I want to remind you of something. God doesn't waste anything. Not your tears, not your prayers, not your pain. He's using it all to shape you, to prepare you, and to lead you closer to His purpose for your life. This truth requires trust. It requires faith that even when things don't go our way, even when the answers seem delayed, God is still in control. And let me tell you something, the outcome is always better when it's placed in God's hands. Now, before we move forward, I want to take a brief moment to invite you to go even deeper with us. By clicking the Join button below, you can become a part of our exclusive community. As a member, you'll gain access to deeper reflections, exclusive content, and a space where we grow together in faith and purpose. More than just clicking a button, you'll be planting a seed in a ministry that seeks to spread God's word and encourage hearts around the world. Take this step, and let's continue this journey of faith together. Returning to our reflection, let's not forget the second part of the verse. Those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This isn't a promise for everyone. It's a promise for those who love God, who have chosen to walk in His ways. Loving God means trusting Him, even in uncertainty. It means choosing faith over fear, surrender over control, and worship over worry. So let me ask you this, can you trust God in the messy middle? Can you hold on to His promise even when the pieces of your life don't seem to fit together? Take a deep breath and let this truth settle in your heart. God is working, even now. He's working in ways you can't see, through details you don't know, and for outcomes you can't yet imagine. As we move into the next section, we'll uncover how our perspective in times of uncertainty can shape not only our faith, but also our ability to see God's hand at work in every detail of our lives. Because sometimes the miracle isn't just in the destination, it's in the journey itself. Number 6, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. Trust. It's such a simple word, yet it carries so much weight. We talk about trusting God often, but living it out, especially when the road ahead seems unclear or filled with obstacles, is one of the greatest challenges of faith. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5-6 gives us both a command and a promise. The command is clear. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And the promise follows. He will make your paths straight. But notice what the verse doesn't say. It doesn't promise that the path will be easy or that it will be immediately visible. It doesn't say we'll always understand why God leads us a certain way. Instead, it asks us to trust Him with all our heart. That means surrendering not just the big decisions of life, but the small everyday moments too. It means choosing faith even when fear whispers doubts into our minds. Trusting God requires us to let go of our need for control. And if we're honest, control is something we all hold on to tightly. We want to know the when, the how, and the why of every situation. We want a roadmap with clear instructions and a guarantee that everything will work out just as we hope. But faith doesn't work that way. Faith asks us to step out when the path isn't clear, to move forward even when we can't see what's ahead. Imagine a child standing on the edge of a swimming pool, their father standing in the water with his arms outstretched. The father says, "Jump, I'll catch you." The child hesitates. They can see the water, they feel the height, and they're scared of the unknown. But then they look into their father's eyes and they see something: love, confidence, and an unwavering promise. And so they jump, not because they understand the physics of the fall, but because they trust the one who asked them to leap. Isn't that how God calls us to trust Him? To step forward even when we don't see the outcome, knowing that His arms are strong enough to catch us. There's a powerful story about Corrie ten Boom, a woman who helped many Jews escape the horrors of the Holocaust by hiding them in her home. At one point, she and her family were arrested and sent to concentration camps. In the middle of unimaginable suffering, Corrie held onto her faith. One of her most famous quotes is this: "Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God." Her life was an example of this verse in action. She didn't lean on her own understanding, because if she had, she would have been consumed by fear and despair. Instead, she trusted God with her whole heart, even when the path was dark and uncertain. And through her faith, countless lives were touched and saved. You might not be facing a situation as extreme as Corrie ten Boom's, but perhaps you're facing your own moment of uncertainty. Maybe it's a decision about your career, a relationship, your health, or your finances. Maybe you're standing at the edge of your own metaphorical swimming pool and God is saying, "Jump, trust me." Here's a question worth reflecting on. Are you trusting God with all your heart, or just the parts that feel safe and comfortable? Are you leaning on your own understanding, or are you truly surrendering your plans, fears, and dreams to Him? Trusting God doesn't mean we'll always have clarity, but it does mean we'll have peace. It doesn't mean every outcome will align with our expectations, but it does mean every outcome will align with His purpose. Take a moment to let this truth settle deep in your heart. When you can't see the way forward, trust the one who holds the map. Maybe you're at a crossroads right now, wondering which direction to take. Maybe you've been trying to figure it all out on your own, and it's left you feeling exhausted and confused. If that's you, pause for a moment, breathe deeply, and remember the promise of these verses. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. God doesn't just see the next step, He sees the entire journey. He knows every twist and turn, every detour and delay, and His promise is clear. If you trust Him, He will guide you. As we continue, we'll explore how surrendering to God's plan not only brings peace, but also unlocks blessings we might have missed had we chosen to rely on our own limited understanding. Because sometimes, the most powerful step of faith is simply saying, "God, I trust you." Number 7, Psalm chapter 37, verse 7. "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes." Stillness. It's not something that comes naturally to most of us. We live in a world driven by constant motion, immediate gratification, and instant results. Our calendars are packed, our phones are buzzing, and our minds rarely find a moment of peace. Yet in Psalm chapter 37, verse 7, we are given two powerful instructions: be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. To be still is not just about physical stillness, it's about quieting the noise within us. It's about silencing the restless thoughts, the worries, and the relentless what-ifs that crowd our minds. Stillness before God is an act of surrender. It's saying, "God, I trust you enough to stop striving, to stop worrying, and to wait patiently for your perfect timing." But notice the second part of the verse. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways. Isn't that one of the hardest parts of waiting? Watching others seem to move ahead while we feel stuck in place? It's so easy to look around and compare our journey to someone else's, wondering why their prayers seem answered while ours remain in waiting. But comparison is one of the enemy's most effective tools. It steals our peace, distorts our perspective, and plants seeds of doubt in our hearts. God's timing is not a competition. Your journey is your journey, designed uniquely by God. When He asks you to wait, it's not because He's forgotten you, it's because He's preparing something specifically for you. Think about a baker preparing bread. The dough must sit and rise for a specific amount of time before it's ready for the oven. If the baker rushes the process, the bread will be dense and undercooked. But if the baker waits patiently, allowing the dough to rise fully, the result is a loaf that's light, fluffy, and perfect. In the same way, God asks us to be still and wait because He knows the timing needed for our bread, our blessings, our dreams, our breakthroughs to be ready. There's a story about two farmers who both planted their crops at the same time. One farmer grew impatient when the rains didn't come immediately, so he abandoned his field, believing the harvest was doomed. The other farmer continued to tend his land faithfully, even in the dry season. He watered, he weeded, and he waited. When the rains finally came, the second farmer reaped an abundant harvest, while the first farmer's field lay barren. How often do we abandon our own fields, our dreams, our prayers, our faith, simply because we don't see immediate results? How often do we give up right before the rain comes? Being still doesn't mean being passive. It means faithfully showing up. It means continuing to pray, to believe, and to prepare your heart, even when the answers seem delayed. It means trusting that God's silence is not his absence, and his delay is not his denial. But being still also requires patience, and patience is one of the hardest virtues to cultivate. It's easy to say, "I'll wait on God," but it's much harder to live it out when the days turn into months or the months into years. Yet every moment of stillness, every act of patient faith is building something in you, something strong, unshakable, and deeply rooted in God's promises. Take a moment to pause and reflect. Are you fighting the stillness, or are you embracing it? Are you filling the quiet moments with worry, or are you allowing God's peace to fill the silence? There's a reason this verse begins with "Be still before the Lord." Stillness is the foundation of trust. It's in the quiet moments that we hear God's voice most clearly. It's in the stillness that we find the strength to keep going. Let this thought settle in your heart. God is working while you're waiting. The silence isn't empty. It's full of his purpose. Maybe today God is inviting you to stop striving, stop comparing, and simply be still, not because he wants to hold something back from you, but because he wants to prepare you for what's ahead. If you feel like this message was meant for you, take a moment to let it sink in. Whisper a simple prayer. "Lord, help me to be still and trust you." In the next section, we'll explore how God uses these quiet seasons not only to refine our patience, but also to deepen our faith, because often it's in the stillness that we experience the most profound growth. Number 8, Lamentations chapter 3, verses 25 to 26. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Waiting quietly, it's a concept that feels almost foreign in our fast-paced, noise-filled world. Every day, we're bombarded with notifications, deadlines, and voices telling us to hurry up, to achieve more, to move faster. But Lamentations, chapter 3, verses 25-26, offers a countercultural invitation. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. This verse isn't just about waiting, it's about how we wait. Waiting quietly doesn't mean sitting still and doing nothing. It means waiting with trust, with peace, and with a heart anchored in hope. It means silencing the inner turmoil and choosing to focus on God's faithfulness instead of our circumstances. But let's be honest, waiting quietly is hard. When we're facing uncertainty, pain, or a long stretch of silence from God, our natural instinct is to wrestle, to question, to try to force an outcome. We want to fix the situation ourselves. But quiet waiting isn't about fixing, it's about surrendering. Think about a child who wakes up in the middle of the night from a nightmare. They run to their parents' room, climb into their arms, and despite the fear they felt moments before, they fall back asleep. Why? Because they trust the one holding them. The fear hasn't disappeared, but the presence of someone they trust brings peace. In the same way, God asks us to rest in him, to let his presence quiet our fears and still our restless hearts. Quiet waiting is not passive, it's deeply spiritual. It's an act of worship, a declaration that we believe God is working even when we can't see it. There's a powerful story about a man named George Mueller, a Christian evangelist who cared for thousands of orphans in the 19th century. Müller was known for his radical faith and his commitment to prayer. He often prayed for specific needs: food, clothing, shelter, with no backup plan, no safety net, and no guarantee of immediate provision. And yet God always came through. One winter morning, the orphanage had run out of food entirely. The children were seated at the table, their plates empty, and Müller stood at the head of the table. Instead of panicking, he bowed his head and thanked God for the food he was about to provide. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. A baker stood outside with a delivery of fresh bread. Shortly after, a milkman whose cart had broken down nearby offered all his milk to the orphanage before it spoiled. Müller's story is a profound example of quiet waiting. He didn't rush out in a frenzy, trying to solve the problem on his own. He waited on God with gratitude and expectation, and God showed up. How often do we panic when provision isn't immediately visible? How often do we let anxiety drown out God's gentle invitation to wait quietly in His presence? Quiet waiting isn't weakness, it's strength under control. It's choosing to hope in God's goodness even when everything around us feels uncertain. But notice another part of the verse. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in Him. Our hope must have an anchor, and that anchor is God Himself. Not our abilities, not our resources, not our timelines. Him. When we hope in God, we remind ourselves of who He is, faithful, loving, and sovereign. And when our hope is rooted in His character, our hearts find peace in the waiting. Perhaps you're in a season right now where quiet waiting feels impossible. Maybe your prayers feel unanswered, your dreams feel delayed, or your heart feels heavy with frustration. But let me remind you, God sees you, He hears you, and He is good to those whose hope is in Him. Take a moment and ask yourself, are you waiting with a quiet, trusting heart or with restless impatience? Are you letting God's peace fill the silence, or are you letting fear and doubt take over? If this verse speaks to you, let it be a declaration today. I will wait quietly, and I will place my hope in the Lord. Quiet waiting doesn't mean you stop praying, stop dreaming, or stop believing. It means you keep doing those things with a heart anchored in peace and a spirit that trusts God's perfect timing. As we move forward, we'll explore how waiting isn't just about endurance, it's about transformation. Because often, God isn't just preparing the blessing, He's preparing you. And in the stillness, in the quiet, something powerful is happening. You're becoming who God created you to be. Number 9, James chapter 1, verses 2-4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Joy in trials, it feels almost contradictory, doesn't it? How can we possibly consider it pure joy when we face hardships, delays, or seasons of uncertainty? And yet, James writes these words not as a suggestion, but as a profound invitation. Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. James isn't asking us to enjoy suffering or pretend that everything is fine when it's not. He's not calling us to ignore our pain or dismiss our struggles. Instead, he's inviting us to shift our perspective, to see our challenges not as obstacles, but as opportunities. Opportunities to grow, to mature, and to deepen our trust in God. Think about gold being refined in fire. The raw material isn't beautiful at first. It's mixed with impurities, rough edges, and hidden flaws. But when gold is placed in intense heat, something extraordinary happens. The impurities rise to the surface and are removed, leaving behind pure, radiant gold. That's what trials do for our faith. They refine us. They reveal what's in our hearts, our doubts, our fears, our pride, and give us a chance to surrender those things to God. But notice something important. James says that perseverance must finish its work. That means we can't cut the process short. We can't walk away from the fire before the refining is complete. It's in the waiting, in the trial, in the uncomfortable spaces, that God does some of His most important work in us. He's not just focused on the destination, he's deeply invested in the transformation that happens along the way. There's a story about a man who found a butterfly cocoon. He noticed a tiny hole and watched for hours as the butterfly struggled to push its body through the small opening. At one point, the man decided to help. He took a pair of scissors and carefully cut the cocoon open, allowing the butterfly to emerge easily. But something was wrong. The butterfly's body was swollen and its wings were small and shriveled. It never flew. What the man didn't realize was that the butterfly's struggle to emerge from the cocoon was necessary. The pressure of squeezing through that tiny hole was what pushed the fluid from its body into its wings, allowing it to become strong enough to fly. How often do we, like the man with the butterfly, try to cut short the struggles God is using to strengthen us? How often do we beg God to remove the trial when He's using it to prepare us for something greater? James reminds us that perseverance has a purpose, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. God isn't content with halfway transformation. He's not interested in superficial faith or partial healing. He wants us to be mature and complete. But here's the key. Maturity doesn't come without testing, strength doesn't come without resistance, and faith doesn't grow without seasons that challenge it. Think about your own life. Can you look back on a difficult season and see how God used it to shape you? Maybe it was a financial struggle that taught you to trust His provision. Maybe it was a heartbreak that led you closer to His love. Maybe it was a delay that prepared you for a blessing you couldn't have handled before. Whatever it was, the truth remains the same. God doesn't waste our trials. So how do we embrace joy in the middle of hardship? How do we hold on to hope when everything feels heavy? It starts with perspective. When we face trials, we can either see them as obstacles or as opportunities. We can either let them break us or let them build us. This doesn't mean pretending to be happy when we're hurting. It means anchoring our hope in the knowledge that God is working, even in this. Even now, take a moment and ask yourself, are you letting perseverance finish its work in your life? Are you trusting that the struggle has a purpose, even if you can't see it yet? Here's a thought to hold on to. Sometimes God doesn't remove the storm because He's using it to strengthen your faith. If this message speaks to you, let it sink deep into your heart. Whisper a simple prayer. Lord, help me to trust You in the trial. Help me to see the purpose in the waiting. In the next section, we'll explore how trusting God in the midst of our trials doesn't just change our circumstances, it transforms us. Because faith isn't just about believing for a blessing, it's about becoming the person God created you to be in the process. Number 10, Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. There's a weariness that comes not just from hardship, but from doing good and seeing no immediate results. Have you ever poured your heart into something, a ministry, a relationship, a dream, only to feel like nothing is changing? Like your effort, your prayers, and your sacrifices are disappearing into an empty void. It's in those moments that Galatians chapter 6, verse 9 speaks with such clarity. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. This verse doesn't dismiss the reality of weariness. The Apostle Paul understood something profound. Even good work can be exhausting when the results aren't immediately visible. Faithfulness can feel heavy when it seems to go unnoticed. But Paul offers us two key reminders. There is a proper time and there is a harvest. Let's focus on those two words, proper time. God's timing isn't random, it's intentional. Just like a farmer doesn't plant seeds one day and expect a full crop the next, we shouldn't expect immediate results from the seeds we've planted in faith. The farmer understands the seasons. He knows there's a time for planting, a time for waiting, and a time for harvesting. If he grows impatient and abandons the field too soon, he'll miss the reward of his labor. The same is true for us. Every prayer you've prayed, every act of kindness you've shown, every step of obedience you've taken, they're seeds planted in faith, and they will bear fruit, but only in God's proper time. But here's the challenge. The waiting season feels long. The middle ground between planting and harvest can feel endless, and the temptation to give up can feel overwhelming. There's a story of a missionary who spent years serving in a remote village. Day after day, he shared the gospel. Year after year, he poured his heart into the community. But despite his efforts, no one seemed to respond. Disheartened, he considered leaving, but something in his spirit told him to stay. One day, a young boy approached him with tears in his eyes. He said, "I've been listening to you all these years, and I'm ready to follow Jesus." That single decision sparked a chain reaction. Others in the village began to listen, hearts began to soften, and lives were transformed. The missionary realized something profound. The seeds he had planted hadn't been wasted. God had been working all along, even when he couldn't see it. How often do we walk away from our fields because we're tired of waiting? How many blessings have we missed because we gave up right before the breakthrough? The second part of the verse is equally important. If we do not give up. Perseverance is the bridge between planting and harvest. It's the glue that holds our faith together in the middle ground. But let's be honest, perseverance is hard. It's messy, it's tiring, and sometimes it feels lonely. If you're in a season where you feel weary, where your prayers feel unanswered, your work feels unappreciated, or your faith feels stretched, I want you to hear this. Don't give up. Don't stop praying. Don't stop believing. Don't stop showing up, because your harvest is coming. But here's the secret. The harvest isn't always what we expect. Sometimes the fruit of our labor isn't immediate success. It's a deeper relationship with God. Sometimes the harvest isn't a change in our circumstances. It's a change in us. Think about your own life. Are there areas where you've felt like giving up? Are there dreams you've buried, prayers you've stopped praying, or steps of faith you've stopped taking? Take a moment to reflect on this truth. Your faithfulness is never wasted. God sees it, God honors it, and God will bring a harvest in His perfect time. Before we continue, I want to invite you into something special. By clicking the Join button below, you'll become part of a close-knit community where we go even deeper into reflections like these. You'll gain access to exclusive content, heartfelt encouragement, and a space where your faith can grow alongside others who are walking the same journey. This isn't just about supporting a channel, it's about building a family rooted in faith. Now let's come back to our verse. At the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. The harvest is coming. The seeds you've planted are growing, even if you can't see them yet. God is at work in ways you might not understand right now, but one day you'll look back and see the purpose in every moment of waiting, every act of faith, and every tear you've cried. Let this truth settle in your heart. God's timing is perfect, and your perseverance is not in vain. In the next section, we'll explore how God not only rewards our perseverance, but also uses it to prepare us for even greater things. Because sometimes the most important work God does isn't through us, it's in us. Number 11, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 36. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised. Perseverance. It's a word we hear often in church, in motivational talks, and in moments when someone is trying to encourage us not to give up. But perseverance isn't just about holding on for dear life during a storm. It's not just about gritting our teeth and enduring hardship. It's about something much deeper, aligning our lives with God's will and staying faithful until His promises are fulfilled. The writer of Hebrews doesn't sugarcoat it. You need to persevere. It's not optional. It's not something we can bypass if we want to experience God's promises. Perseverance isn't just about reaching the finish line, it's about staying on the path, even when it's steep, rocky, or unclear. But let's be honest, perseverance is hard. It's tiring, it's often lonely. There are seasons where giving up seems so much easier than holding on. Maybe you've been praying for a breakthrough in your marriage, your health, your finances, or your spiritual life. And maybe, despite your prayers, the situation hasn't changed. Maybe it's even gotten worse. In those moments, the temptation to walk away from the path God has laid out for you feels so strong. But this verse reminds us, you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised. Did you catch that? When you have done the will of God. Perseverance isn't just about waiting, it's about doing. It's about remaining obedient to God's will, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it feels unfair, and even when every fiber of your being wants to quit. Think about Noah. God gave him an assignment to build an ark. In a time and place where rain was unheard of, day after day, Noah hammered nails, cut wood, and followed God's instructions. And all the while, people mocked him, questioned him, and doubted his sanity. But Noah persevered, and because he did, he and his family were saved when the floodwaters came. What if Noah had stopped halfway? What if he had said, "This is taking too long. People are laughing at me. Maybe I misunderstood God's instructions." But he didn't. He stayed faithful to God's will, and he received the promise. In the same way, God asks us to keep building, to keep obeying, to keep trusting, and to keep moving forward, even when it feels pointless. Because here's the truth, faithfulness in the small things prepares us for the bigger promises. There's a story about a man named William Carey, known as the father of modern missions. Carey felt called to bring the gospel to India. He faced immense challenges, opposition, financial struggles, cultural barriers, and personal loss. For 7 years, Carey preached without seeing a single conversion. Can you imagine the perseverance it took to keep going in the face of such discouragement? But Carey stayed faithful. He continued the work God had called him to do, and eventually people began to turn to Christ. Today, his legacy lives on as one of the most impactful missionaries in history. But here's the question, what if William Carey had given up in year 6? The same question applies to us. What if you're on the verge of a breakthrough, but you walk away because the wait feels too long? God's promises aren't delivered according to our timelines. They come according to His will and His perfect plan. And our role in this process is to persevere. But how do we find the strength to keep going when we feel like we have nothing left to give? The answer lies in staying connected to God. Perseverance isn't about sheer willpower. It's about relying on His strength, His grace, and His promises. Take a moment and think about your own journey. Are there areas where you've been tempted to give up? Are there prayers you've stopped praying, dreams you've abandoned, or steps of faith you've avoided because the wait feels too long? If that's you, let this verse remind you of something powerful. God isn't just asking you to persevere for the sake of endurance. He's asking you to persevere because there's a promise on the other side. Let this truth anchor your heart. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised. The promise is real. The harvest is coming, but the path to it requires endurance, faithfulness, and trust. Take this moment to whisper a simple prayer. Lord, help me to persevere. Help me to stay faithful to your will, even when it's hard. If this message has resonated with you, let it settle deep in your heart. The promise isn't just for someone else, it's for you. In the next section, we'll dive deeper into how God often uses our seasons of perseverance, not only to prepare us for the promise, but also to reveal His presence in ways we might not expect. Because sometimes the greatest blessing isn't just receiving what we've been waiting for, it's discovering who God is in the waiting. Number 12. Psalm chapter 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Stillness. In a world constantly shouting for our attention, demanding productivity and celebrating busyness, stillness feels almost unnatural. Yet in Psalm chapter 46, verse 10, God commands us, "Be still and know that I am God." This verse isn't just a gentle suggestion, it's a divine instruction. It's a call to pause, to let go of control, and to recognize God's sovereignty in our lives. But being still doesn't mean doing nothing. It doesn't mean passivity or inactivity. Instead, it's about quieting our hearts, silencing the noise around us, and tuning into God's voice. The Hebrew word for be still in this verse, rapha, carries the idea of letting go, releasing our grip, and ceasing our striving. It's as if God is saying, stop trying to control everything. Stop wrestling with outcomes you can't change. Stop carrying burdens you were never meant to bear. Let go, and let me be God. But here's the thing, letting go is hard. Trusting God with the unresolved questions, the unmet expectations, and the uncertain future feels risky. We hold on to our plans, our timelines, and our ideas of how things should be because it gives us a sense of control. But control is an illusion, and every time we try to take God's place on the throne of our lives, we step further away from peace. Imagine you're in a boat in the middle of a storm. The waves are crashing, the wind is howling, and the water is pouring in faster than you can scoop it out. Panic sets in. You start bailing water, screaming for help, and gripping the sides of the boat in fear. But then you hear a voice, calm, steady, and firm, saying, "Stop, be still, trust me." That's what God says to us in our storms. When life feels chaotic, when the answers aren't coming, and when fear begins to take over, God invites us to be still, not because the storm isn't real, but because His presence is greater. There's a powerful story in the Gospels where Jesus and His disciples are caught in a fierce storm while crossing the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are terrified, convinced they're about to drown. But where is Jesus? He's asleep in the boat, in the middle of the storm. In the middle of chaos, Jesus is perfectly still. When the disciples wake Him, panicking and crying out for help, Jesus rises, stretches out His hand and says, "Peace, be still." And in an instant, the storm stops. The sea becomes calm. But notice this, the disciples weren't still, the storm was. Jesus' command wasn't just for the waves, it was also for their hearts. How often do we let the storms inside us rage louder than the storms around us? How often do we allow fear, doubt, and anxiety to drown out the still, small voice of God saying, "Be still and know that I am God"? Stillness isn't about avoiding the storm. It's about knowing who is in the boat with you. But stillness isn't just about trust. It's also about awareness. The second part of the verse says, "And know that I am God." When we're still, when we let go of our need for control, we create space to truly know God, to recognize His power, to feel His presence, and to experience His peace. There's a story of a woman who had been praying for years for clarity about her life's purpose. She had tried everything, reading books, attending seminars, seeking advice, but no answers came. One day, exhausted and frustrated, she decided to spend an afternoon in silence before God. No talking, no asking, no striving, just stillness. In that quiet space, she felt God whisper to her heart, "Stop chasing answers, start seeking me." Sometimes the answers we're desperately searching for aren't found in more activity, more effort, or more striving. They're found in stillness. They're found in the quiet moments where we stop trying to be God and simply allow Him to be God. Maybe you're in a season right now where everything feels loud, your worries, your doubts, your fears. Maybe you've been striving, pushing, and exhausting yourself trying to fix things, understand things, or force things to happen. If that's you, let this verse speak directly to your heart. Be still and know that I am God. Stillness isn't weakness. It's faith in action. It's an act of surrender, a posture of trust, and a declaration that we believe God is who He says He is. Take a moment right now, pause, breathe deeply, and whisper this prayer. Lord, help me to be still. Help me to trust You. Help me to know that You are God. Here's a thought to hold on to. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop, be still, and let God be God. In the next section, we'll explore how stillness isn't just about waiting, it's also about listening, because often it's in the quiet moments that God speaks the loudest. Number 13, Exodus chapter 14, verse 14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. This verse carries a profound promise and a gentle command, a declaration of God's power and a call for us to trust. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. These words weren't spoken in a moment of calm. They were spoken in a moment of crisis. The Israelites stood trapped between the Red Sea in front of them and Pharaoh's army closing in behind them. Fear gripped their hearts, and escape seemed impossible. But in that moment of panic and hopelessness, Moses spoke these words of assurance. God wasn't asking the Israelites to fight their way out, to build boats, or to negotiate with their enemies. He was asking them to be still. It's easy to trust God when life is smooth, when the path is clear, and when the answers come quickly. But it's another thing entirely to stand still when everything around you screams for action, for control, for a quick fix. Stillness in the face of danger, uncertainty, or fear feels counterintuitive. Our instinct is to do something. We want to fix, manipulate, and force our way through the problem. But God's ways are not our ways. He doesn't need our frantic activity to accomplish His will. Sometimes He asks us to step back, to stop striving, and to trust that He will fight for us. Imagine a child being bullied on a playground. The child is overwhelmed, scared, and unsure of what to do. But then their parent steps onto the playground, takes their hand and says, "It's okay, I'm here, I'll handle this." In that moment, the child doesn't need to fight. They simply need to trust. In the same way, God steps into our battles and says, "I've got this, you don't need to fight alone, be still and trust me." But being still doesn't mean being passive. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means surrendering control. It means releasing the outcome to God and believing that He is fully capable of handling what feels impossible to us. There's a story of a woman named Sarah who was battling a long-term illness. She had seen countless doctors, tried every treatment, and prayed fervently for healing, but her condition remained unchanged. At one point, she found herself exhausted, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. In that place of weariness, she came across Exodus chapter 14, verse 14. She realized something profound. She had been fighting in her own strength, carrying a burden she was never meant to carry. That day, she whispered a simple prayer. "Lord, I surrender this battle to you. I trust you to fight for me." Over time, Sarah's perspective began to shift. Her peace returned, her anxiety faded, and while her circumstances didn't change immediately, her heart did. She began to see God's hand in ways she had missed before. The truth is, not every battle we face will have an immediate resolution. Sometimes God delivers us through the battle rather than from it. But whether the Red Sea parts immediately or we walk through the wilderness for a while longer, His promise remains: the Lord will fight for you. But here's something important. Stillness isn't about inaction. It's about trusting the right action. The Israelites still had to walk through the parted sea. Sarah still had to show up for her doctor's appointments, and you still have to move forward in faith, even while trusting God to fight the battle. So, what does being still look like in your life right now? Maybe it means letting go of trying to control someone else's decisions. Maybe it means stopping your frantic search for answers and sitting quietly in God's presence. Maybe it means surrendering a relationship, a financial struggle, or a painful past into His hands. Whatever it is, remember this: God doesn't need your strength to win the battle. He needs your trust. Take a moment and reflect. Are you still fighting battles that God has already promised to fight for you? Are you holding on to control in areas where God is asking you to surrender? Here's a thought to carry with you. Sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't charging into battle. It's stepping back and letting God take the lead. If this verse speaks to you, let it settle deep in your heart. Whisper this prayer: "Lord, I trust you to fight for me. Help me to be still and know that you are in control." As we continue into the next section, we'll explore how God's victories in our lives aren't just about overcoming battles, they're about transforming our hearts in the process. Because every battle God fights for us becomes a testimony of His faithfulness, His power, and His love. Number 14, Philippians chapter 4, verse 6-7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Anxiety. It's a word that feels all too familiar in our modern world. Worry about the future, fear of the unknown, stress about finances, relationships, and health. It can all feel overwhelming. But in Philippians chapter 4, verses 6-7, the Apostle Paul offers us a remedy for this relentless anxiety: prayer, thanksgiving, and trust. Notice the command at the start: do not be anxious about anything. At first glance, it might seem impossible. How can we not be anxious when life throws so many uncertainties our way? But Paul isn't giving an unrealistic command. He's giving us a divine strategy. Anxiety often begins when we try to control things that are beyond our control. We replay conversations in our minds, imagine worst-case scenarios, and let fear dictate our thoughts. But Paul tells us that instead of being consumed by anxiety, we are to present our requests to God. Prayer isn't just a spiritual activity, it's an exchange. When we pray, we're not just speaking into the void. We're bringing our fears, our worries, and our burdens to the God who holds the universe in His hands. But here's the key: with thanksgiving. Why thanksgiving? Because gratitude shifts our focus. It reminds us of God's faithfulness in the past, and it builds our confidence in His provision for the future. Thanksgiving isn't about denying our problems, it's about declaring that God is bigger than them. Imagine you're carrying a heavy backpack filled with rocks. Each rock represents a worry, a fear, or a burden. The weight feels unbearable. But when you kneel in prayer and present your requests to God, it's like taking out those rocks one by one and laying them at His feet. And as you release each weight, something incredible happens. The peace of God begins to fill the empty spaces. Paul promises that this peace isn't just any peace. It's the peace of God, which transcends all understanding. It's not the kind of peace that comes from perfect circumstances, a positive outcome, or a lack of problems. It's a peace that exists in spite of the storm. Have you ever seen someone walk through an incredibly difficult situation with an unshakable calm? Their circumstances are chaotic, but their spirit is steady. That's not natural, it's supernatural. That's the peace of God. There's a story about a painter who was asked to create an image that represented peace. Many artists submitted paintings of calm oceans, serene landscapes, and blue skies, but one painting stood out. It depicted a stormy sea with dark clouds, crashing waves, and lightning splitting the sky. But right in the middle of the painting, tucked into a crack in a rock, was a small bird sitting on a nest, calm, still, and unafraid. That's the kind of peace God offers us. Not the absence of storms, but peace in the middle of them. But here's something important to notice in this verse. God's peace will guard your hearts and your minds. Anxiety often attacks two key areas: our hearts, our emotions, and our minds, our thoughts. When fear takes root in our hearts, it shapes our emotions. When worry dominates our minds, it controls our thoughts. But God's peace stands guard over both, like a soldier protecting a fortress. Take a moment and ask yourself, what's weighing on your heart today? What thoughts have been running through your mind on repeat? Have you brought those burdens to God, or are you still carrying them on your own? Let me remind you of this truth. You weren't meant to carry this weight alone. God invites you to bring every fear, every worry, and every uncertainty to Him. And He doesn't just promise to listen, He promises to replace your anxiety with His peace. But here's the catch: we have to let go. We can't fully receive God's peace while still clinging to our fears. We can't surrender halfway. Take a deep breath and let these words settle into your heart. The peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. God's peace is available to you right now, in this moment. It's not reserved for perfect Christians or extraordinary situations. It's for you. If you're struggling with anxiety today, whisper this prayer: Lord, I give you my worries. I trust you with the unknown. Fill me with your peace that transcends all understanding. And as you move forward, remember, peace isn't the absence of problems. It's the presence of God. In our next section, we'll dive deeper into how living in God's peace doesn't just change our internal world. It transforms how we interact with the world around us. Because a life anchored in God's peace becomes a testimony to His power. Number 15, Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. As we reach the conclusion of this journey, let's take a moment to breathe, to pause, and to let the weight of God's promises settle deep into our hearts. Through every verse, every reflection, and every story we've explored together, one truth has stood out above all. God's timing is perfect. His plans are not only good, they are intentional, loving, and crafted specifically for you. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, we are given one of the most comforting promises in all of Scripture. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Notice that God doesn't say, I'm figuring out the plans as I go, or I'm hoping things will work out. No, He says, I know the plans I have for you. God isn't guessing. He isn't uncertain. He isn't making adjustments on the fly based on how things unfold. He knows, and if God knows the plans, we can trust the process. But here's where it gets hard. Trusting the process often means walking through seasons of waiting, uncertainty, and even disappointment. It means holding on to the promise even when the reality doesn't match it yet. It means believing that God's not yet isn't the same as no. Looking back at everything we've shared in this video, we've seen the importance of trusting God's timing, the power of stillness, the beauty of perseverance, and the strength that comes from admitting our weaknesses and leaning on God's grace. Each verse has reminded us of one simple, profound truth: God is faithful. Maybe you've been waiting on an answer, a breakthrough, or a miracle. Maybe you've been praying for something so long that hope feels faint and fragile. But let me remind you of this: God hasn't forgotten you. Your prayers haven't been lost. Your tears haven't been ignored. Every moment, every detail, every struggle, it's all held in His hands. There's a story about a tapestry. On one side, it looks chaotic: knotted threads, tangled colors, and no clear pattern. But on the other side, there's a beautiful, intricate design. Life often feels like the messy side of that tapestry. We see the knots, the loose ends, and the confusion. But God sees the other side. He sees the masterpiece, and one day, He'll turn it around and show you how every thread had a purpose. In your waiting, in your trusting, and in your persevering, remember this: God is weaving something beautiful out of the threads of your life. And when the time is right, when His appointed moment arrives, you'll see it. You'll understand why certain doors closed, why certain prayers were delayed, and why the waiting was necessary. But until that day comes, hold on to this promise: I know the plans I have for you. Plans not to harm you, but to prosper you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Before we close, I want to take a moment to thank you. Thank you for spending this time with us, for opening your heart to these reflections, and for walking this journey of faith together. Your presence here isn't an accident. It's part of God's plan, and your willingness to seek His word, to grow in faith, and to trust His timing is a testimony to His work in your life. If this message has spoken to your heart today, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments. Write these words: I trust God's perfect timing. And not just as a sentence, but as a declaration of faith, a reminder to yourself and to others who might be reading that you're holding onto God's promises, no matter what. And if you haven't already, I want to personally invite you to subscribe to this channel. By clicking that button, you're not just staying connected to more content, you're helping us spread God's word to even more people who need hope, encouragement, and faith-filled reminders. Together, we can build a community rooted in God's promises. As we wrap up, know that this isn't the end of the journey, it's just a pause. There's so much more ahead, and I encourage you to keep exploring, keep seeking, and keep trusting. Right here on this channel, you'll find more reflections, more lessons, and more reminders of God's incredible love and faithfulness. In just a moment, some suggested videos will appear on your screen, videos carefully chosen to continue building on the message you've heard today. So as you go about your day, carry this truth with you. God's timing is perfect, His grace is sufficient, and His plans for you are good. Thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up for your faith, for your growth, and for this community. And above all, thank you for trusting God's perfect timing. Until next time, may you walk in peace, may you trust in His plans, and may you find strength in His promises. Remember, He knows the plans He has for you.